The cab rolled to a stop in front of my daughter's house, sleek gray siding, black-trimmed windows, and a lawn so perfect it looked artificial. I stepped out slowly, the stiffness in my knees, reminding me how long the trip from Oregon had been. 2 suitcases, 1 aching hip, and a heart full of cautious hope. Delaney opened the front door just as I reached the steps. "Mom," she said with a smile that flickered too quickly, "you made it." Her hug was polite brief. Her scent, some expensive floral blend, lingered longer than her touch. Inside, everything gleamed. Cool-toned furniture, chrome accents, no clutter, no family photos. It was beautiful, yes, but sterile. Like a space curated for a magazine shoot, not for living. As I glanced toward the staircase, she hesitated. "Actually, she began Joanne's staying with us for a while. Knee surgery, remember? So the guest room's taken." A pause. "But we've got something nice fixed up for you." I followed her through the kitchen, out the back door, and across a trimmed lawn to a small structure painted to match the house. A converted barn. She opened the door with a flourish. "It's cozy." Temporary, of course. The room inside was small and neat. A bed, a chair, a table, and a tiny bathroom behind a folding door. It was clean. It was dry. But it felt like a place you kept things, not people. "It's lovely," I said quietly. She nodded. "I'll let you settle in. Dinner's at 7. When the door shut behind her, the silence settled like dust in my chest. I sat on the edge of the bed, still trying not to wonder what I'd just walked into. The mattress creaked beneath me as I lay back that first night wrapped in 2 thin blankets and my coat. Cold leaked through the floor despite the space heater humming in the corner. The Wi-Fi cut out halfway through a weather forecast. I gave up trying to read on my tablet and stared at the ceiling instead, tracing the uneven lines where paint met old wood. I thought of the house I'd sold, the narrow hallway lined with photographs, the sagging sofa Harold refused to replace, the garden where I spent summer mornings. It had been falling apart, but it was mine. Here, everything worked, but nothing felt like it belonged to me. Raising Delaney had never been easy. I was already in my late 30s when I had her working full-time and taking night classes to move from circulation desk to library management. I turned down promotions that required travel, skipped book club, stopped painting. Always told myself there'd be time later. I was strict. Too strict, maybe. I remember making her redo spelling homework 3 times because her handwriting was sloppy. I wanted her to have structure, to be better prepared than I ever was. Maybe I overcorrected. Maybe she remembers only the pressure. Dinner that evening was in the kitchen, a white marble island between us like a polite barrier. Joanne sat across from me, eyes sharp behind expensive glasses. She asked where I bought my shoes. I said they were old. She didn't hide her expression. Delaney passed me the salad, barely making eye contact. "Hope the heater's working," she said. "It's only temporary." They both said that often. Temporary. Like I was an uninvited guest lingering too long. The next morning I woke early and found myself alone again. It was late afternoon and I was on my way back to the main house to ask for an extra blanket. The spring evening had dipped colder than I expected. As I reached the sliding glass door off the kitchen, I heard voices sharper than usual. "She should be grateful she's not in a home," Joanne snapped. "She's here now," Delaney replied, her voice lower, strained. "Let's just make it work. I didn't sign up to babysit your mother. She's not my responsibility. She won't be here forever." I stood just outside the door, heart thudding in my chest, before I quietly stepped back and scuffed my shoe on the stone patio. The conversation stopped. I gave it a few seconds, then slid the door open like I hadn't heard a thing. Joanne turned from the counter, perfectly composed. "Oh, Margaret, need something? A blanket if you have one. It gets chilly out there." Delaney retrieved one from the linen closet without looking at me. "Here you go. Hope that helps." I thanked them and left, keeping my expression even. Back in the barn, I folded the blanket neatly across the bed, but didn't sit down. My hands were shaking. It wasn't just what I heard, It was what I'd been sensing since I arrived. The smiles were too tight, the kindness too polished. At breakfast the next day, Joanne complimented my scarf, then immediately asked if I had any plans to get on my feet. Delaney offered to show me how to use a budgeting app to manage limited income. When I asked if I could help with groceries, Joanne laughed and said, "Don't worry, dear. You're not a burden yet." The words were coated in sugar, but they scraped like sandpaper. I began noticing small things. The way Joanne stiffened when I walked into a room. How Delaney rarely spoke unless prompted. The way conversation stopped when I entered. There was a rhythm here, and I was always half a beat behind it. That night, I sat by the small window in the barn, watching the porch light glow in the distance. The air smelled faintly of cut grass and something else, something bitter just beneath the surface. The next morning, I found Delaney waiting by the fence with a mug in her hand. Joanne caught me alone in the kitchen one afternoon while Delaney was still at work. She was stirring something on the stove, lentil soup, I think. But her eyes were fixed on me in that way that made me feel like I was under review. "I must say, Margaret, it's admirable you've managed so long on your own," she said. Voice even. "Most women your age can't. Especially without a second income." I nodded. "I did what I had to." She smiled, just barely. "Still this arrangement. I imagine it's a big adjustment. For all of us." I stayed quiet. She turned down the flame beneath the pot and continued Delaney's trying so hard to keep things afloat. "It's been a rough year. Between the mortgage, the car loan, and that failed renovation," she waved vaguely toward the back hallway. "Well, I just hope you're not too hard on her. She's doing the best she can." It took me a moment to realize what she was implying. I offered to help with groceries again, and again she declined, but this time with a look that said, "That's not the kind of help we mean." That evening, Delaney knocked on the barn door. She was holding 2 mugs of tea, her face softer than it had been in days. "I wanted to talk to you about something," she said. "It's kind of awkward." I took the tea, nodded for her to sit. She cleared her throat. "We're dealing with a temporary cash issue. Just a few things hit us at once. Joanne's medical bills, some home repairs, and my car. It needs a full transmission replacement." I waited. "I was wondering if you could help." "Just 10,000. We'd pay you back as soon as we can. It's just to get us over the hump." She looked genuinely uncomfortable, maybe even embarrassed. Or maybe she was just a good actress. I couldn't tell. I wanted to believe it was the former. "All right," I said quietly. "But it's coming from my savings." "Delaney." "I don't have much." "I know," she said, reaching over to squeeze my hand. "Thank you, Mom." "Really?" I wrote the check that night and she took it with both hands blinking fast. The next morning, I watched Joanne step into a car I hadn't seen before, a sleek, shining SUV. It was close to midnight when I got up to use the bathroom. The barn was quiet, the walls thin enough to hear the wind rattling through the trees. As I reached to turn off the small space heater, I noticed the porch light still glowing at the main house. I moved toward the window and pushed it open a few inches for air. That's when I heard voices, low, tense, but unmistakably theirs. "She won't last long in that barn anyway," Joanne said. Her tone wasn't cruel, just matter of fact, like she was talking about a dog too old for the stairs. "I know," Delaney replied, "but we can't rush it. She's suspicious." "Then stop waiting. Get her to sign the power of attorney while she still trusts you." There was a pause. "She trusts me," Delaney said, but her voice sounded thinner than I'd ever heard it. Joanne's response was sharper. "Then use it. You're the heir, Delaney." It's time she gave it up. What's the point of waiting around for what should already be yours? A glass clinked wine, maybe, and the floor creaked as one of them shifted. I stood frozen, hand gripping the edge of the window, my whole body cold, even though the air outside was mild. She said, "It's all she has left," Delaney murmured. Joanne scoffed, "And we all have to make sacrifices. Your mother's had her time. This is your life now. Think about the mortgage. Think about your future." Their voices faded, replaced by the dull hum of night sounds. I closed the window slowly and sat down on the bed, my hand still trembling slightly. I stared at the checkbook on the table, already missing a page. That 10,000 had come with no conditions, no questions, because I loved her, because she was my daughter. But what I'd just heard made everything shift. The coldness I'd tried to ignore wasn't just discomfort. It was strategy. I sat there in the dark, no tears, just a tightening in my chest that I recognized all too well, the moment when something breaks, quietly, but completely. The next day, I asked for a ride to the bank. The next morning, I came to breakfast early, just like always. Joanne offered me coffee without looking up from her phone. Delaney asked how I slept. I said, fine, smiling, as if nothing had shifted. I let them believe I was still the woman who handed over checks with trembling fingers and called it love. After lunch, I asked Delaney if she could drop me at the bank, said I needed to sort out a change of address. She seemed relieved to hear something so mundane. Of course, she said. We'll go after work. That afternoon, while she tapped the steering wheel at red lights and hummed along with the radio, I sat beside her, cataloging every word she'd said to me over the last month. I nodded when she said, "It's good to stay on top of things." When we pulled up to the bank, she offered to come inside. I told her no. "It's personal," I said. "I'll only be a minute." Inside, I moved the bulk of my savings to a new account at another branch. Quiet, untraceable. I left just enough in the old account to keep up appearances. The teller asked if I wanted to cancel the checks. I told her not yet. 2 days later, I visited a law office in the next town over. The receptionist was warm. The lawyer, a woman named Ms. Hanley, didn't blink when I told her I wanted to revise my will. "Are there any family members to consider?" she asked. "Not anymore," I answered. A week after that, I toured Maple Glen. The woman who showed me around was named Claire. She walked, slowly asked about my hobbies, showed me a studio apartment with sunlight pouring across the hardwood floor. "You'd be just 5 blocks from the art center," she said. "And we do garden walks every Sunday." I nodded and put down a deposit. Back at the barn that night, I pulled the checkbook from the drawer and looked at the blank pages like they were tiny threats. My handwriting was still firm. My will was updated. My future, finally, was mine again. The next evening, Delaney knocked with a casserole and a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Delaney came by that morning with unusual enthusiasm, her voice too bright, her movements too precise. "We'd love to have you over for dinner tonight," she said. "Just the 3 of us. Something special." I knew what was coming. I nodded and said I'd be there. At 7 sharp, I walked across the lawn to the house. The dining table was set with candles and wine glasses. Joanne stood by the stove, pretending to stir something. Delaney greeted me with practiced warmth. The smell of rosemary and butter drifted through the room, masking the air of calculation. Dinner began with polite conversation stories I'd already heard, compliments I hadn't earned. Delaney refilled my wine glass twice before we reached dessert. Then she glanced at Joanne. The cue. "Mom," she began, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "We've been thinking about how to make things easier for you." Joanne slid a folder across the table toward me. "This is just something simple. A power of attorney. It would let Delaney help manage your finances, just so nothing gets lost or misused." I picked up the papers, flipped through the pages slowly, my expression neutral. The room was so quiet, I could hear the tick of the kitchen clock. When I reached the last page, I set it down gently and looked up at them both. "I appreciate the concern," I said, "but there's nothing left to manage. I already moved my money. I've updated my will. And I signed a lease at Maple Glen last week." Delaney blinked. Joanne's mouth tightened. "I didn't need to be reminded," I added, "but you helped in your own way." I folded the document and placed it back in the folder. "Thank you for dinner." Their silence followed me to the door. The night air felt colder than usual, but for the first time since I arrived, I breathed easily. The next morning, I began to pack. I woke before the sun and dressed in silence. Everything I owned fit into 2 suitcases and a canvas bag. I folded each item carefully, not out of sentiment, but to keep my hands from shaking. The barn felt smaller than ever, airless, despite the open window. I left the folded blanket on the end of the bed and Harold's photo tucked in my purse. At exactly 8, the cab pulled into the driveway. I stepped outside just as the front door opened. Joanne stood on the porch in her robe, arms crossed. "You're seriously doing this?" she asked, eyes narrow. "After everything Delaney's done for you, I didn't answer." "Ungrateful," she muttered. "We opened our home to you." Delaney came running out seconds later, hair unbrushed, panic, plain on her face. "Mom, wait. Please don't go like this." The driver took my bags. I kept my purse close. Delaney grabbed my arm. "We were counting on that money. We had plans, real needs. Why didn't you just talk to us?" I looked her straight in the eye. "You weren't counting on me, Delaney. Just what I had." She flinched but didn't let go. "I loved you with everything I had," I said quietly. "But that doesn't mean I have to let you use me." She dropped her hand, then stepping back like the words had stung more than a slap. Joanne said something behind her, but I didn't hear it. I was already walking toward the car. The driver opened the door and I slid inside without looking back. As we pulled away, I saw them standing at the edge of the driveway, 2 figures shrinking in the distance, still unable to see what they'd lost. We turned the corner and the house disappeared from view. The apartment at Maple Glen was small, but it felt like mine from the moment I turned the key. I unpacked slowly that first day, placing each item where I wanted it, not where I was told it should go. I bought a small fern from a local shop and set it on the windowsill right next to Harold's photo. He looked out over the same view I did now, quiet streets, a few early dog walkers, the wide sky. Claire from the front desk introduced me to some of the other residents. Most were around my age, some older. There was June, who had a dry wit and an endless supply of crossword puzzles, and Milton, who wore plaid shirts and quoted poetry without warning. No one asked about my family. No one needed to know. On Saturdays, I joined the beginner watercolor class. My hands weren't as steady as they once were, but the colors felt familiar. I painted small things at first, a bowl of oranges, a window, a shadow stretching across a floor. It was quiet work, and that's what I liked most about it. In the afternoons, I read. I had books again stacked in a little wooden crate by the armchair. The library here wasn't big, but it had the right kind of silence. Sometimes I would take a novel and sit by the window, letting the light fall across the page, and the leaves of the fern tremble in the breeze. I didn't speak to Delaney. She didn't call. One evening, I sat on the edge of my bed and looked around at everything I'd chosen for myself. It wasn't grand, but it was mine. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like a guest in someone else's life. The letter came on a Tuesday. A plain envelope with Delaney's handwriting on the front, slightly uneven as if she'd rushed it. I sat with it unopened for nearly an hour, letting it rest on the kitchen table while I finished my tea. When I finally read it, it wasn't an apology. She said things had been hard lately, that Joanne had moved in permanently, that the house felt heavier somehow. She hoped I was doing okay. That was all. I folded the letter and placed it in the back of a drawer I rarely opened. I didn't write back. Some relationships need pruning for the rest of the garden to thrive. I used to think cutting ties meant failure, that it meant giving up. But sometimes it's the only way anything new can grow. At Maple Glen, things kept moving forward. I enrolled in an intermediate watercolor class and began painting bolder scenes, porches, empty chairs, old fences softened by moss and time. I started a small poetry group with June and 2 others from the reading circle. We met on Wednesdays to read aloud our favorite lines, and sometimes our own. One afternoon after class, I stayed behind to clean my brushes. The sunlight poured through the tall windows, catching the edge of my latest canvas. My hands were speckled with blue and ochre. I didn't rush. I liked the quiet. Outside, the wind stirred the trees gently, and someone was laughing across the courtyard. I leaned back in my chair, feeling the warmth on my face, and let the silence settle over me like a soft coat. I wasn't waiting anymore for approval for reconciliation for someone to see me. I was already here fully, and for the first time in years I smiled without needing a reason.